Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to present a summary of the chapters 3 and 4 of my forthcoming book, The Circassian Genocide. This portion deals with the ethnic cleansing of the mountains of Circassia by the Russian army under the command of General Nikolai Yevdokimov. Yevdokimov assembled the Russian-Circassian detachment to drive the rest of the Circassians from their homeland. Abzak elders came to Yevdokimov and asked him to stop building roads and forts on their land, promising to live in peace and accept Russian suzerainty as they had, according to the peace treaty of 1859. Yevdokimov refused. Finally, he allowed them to send a deputation to Prince Baryatinsky in Tbilisi. When the deputation arrived, Baryatinsky was seriously ill, but his assistant, Grigol Arbeliani, suggested that they petition Emperor Alexander himself when he arrived in the region in the fall. In St. Petersburg, War Minister Dmitry Milyutin worked to influence the emperor into rejecting any proposal the Circassians made. In a letter to Alexander of September 10th, the defense minister dismissed the deputation as a trick and a last resort by a defeated enemy. Back in the Caucasus, Yevdokimov was continuing with the Caucasus conquest of Circassia unabated, rapidly constructing roads, forts, and settlements. Alexander arrived in Taman, 40 miles northwest of Anapa, on September 23rd. According to historian Semyon Sadze, over 500 Circassians turned out to ask the emperor not to expel them from their homeland. He describes a touching and unlikely scene in which the Circassians laid down their swords, fell to the ground, and swore their fealty to the emperor. Alexander continued his tour, eventually visiting the Nizhno-Abadzevsky detachment on the 27th. The deputation arrived and met with Reserve Commander Milyanty Alshevsky, who counseled them on the accepted manner of presenting a petition to the emperor. The next day, the deputation, led by Ubek Representative Haji Berzega, met with the emperor. Alexander agreed to accept the Circassian submission on condition that they fulfill all the administration's demands, including the return of Russian deserters. Cartographer Mikhail Venyukov, who was present, reports what happened next. Quote, after the sovereign's gracious reception of the delegates, Count Yevdokimov became frightened by the idea that the mountaineers would accept the emperor's proposition and remain on their land under Russian protection, which he didn't want to allow, having already made up his mind to expel them from the mountains to the last man. Aware of the Asiatics' naivete, he ordered Colonel Abdurrahman, an ethnic Circassian with whom he was close, to go to them that night and convince them that they could now demand everything, even the withdrawal from our troops from beyond the Lava and the Kuban, and the dismantlement of our fortresses, end quote. The statement Berzega gave the emperor the next day began by enumerating Russian violations of the peace of 1859, followed by an offer of peaceful coexistence if the Russians would stop building roads and fortifications in the mountains and would take care in locating new Cossack stanitsi so that the Circassian herding routes wouldn't be disrupted. Essentially the same thing the Circassians have been asking for since the 1760s. Alexander was offended and gave the Circassians 1 month deadline to decide whether they wished to move to the lowlands or to emigrate to Turkey. Whether the final form of the petition was influenced by Abdurrahman or not is unclear, but Venyukov was convinced that it was Yevdokimov's plot that sabotaged the meeting. As for Abdurrahman, Venyukov admits that he couldn't tell if he believed Yevdokimov was a co-conspirator in the Count's insidious plan to dupe his countrymen. At the beginning of November 1861, the final Russian assault on the Circassia began with 65 combat battalions, 25 Cossack divisions, and 100 cannons. Reports abound of massacres throughout the final campaign, some for revenge and some for expediency's sake. In an example of the former, in April 1862, the army gathered at the headwaters of the Fars River, 40 miles northeast of Sochi, and attacked the Circassians and Abazas there. The battle continued up the mountains where the Russians encountered a large Circassian contingent and were forced to retreat. In retaliation, the Russians slaughtered hundreds of Circassians they came across who had run out of ammunition. However, more frequently, the Russians simply found it expedient to use their cannons indiscriminately. In one instant, General Tykotski's men began building roads along the Bielaya River in late June and bombarded the forest where the Circassians were hiding after their owls had been burned. Afterwards, there were numerous massacres in which Circassian fighters were apparently making good on an oath they had taken to die fighting. Russian troops combing the mountains and destroying owls were repeatedly attacked by Circassian forces that stood their ground even when being showered with cannon fire. Officer Ivan Dravzdov witnessed the battle in spring 1863 in which unarmed Circassians charged desperately, quote, literally throwing themselves on our bayonets. In the beginning, Yevdokimov concealed his plan to drive all the Circassians to Turkey despite Alexander's promise to grant them land north of the Kuban. As the campaign progressed, the entire Caucasus Command adopted the position that the only acceptable number of Circassians in the empire was none. In September 1863, Caucasus Staff Commander Alexander Kartsov argued falsely that since the Abzaks had repeatedly violated the 1859 treaty, they couldn't be trusted anywhere within Russia's borders. He concluded that the measures taken against the mountaineers may seem brutal, but they were compelled by bitter need. 50 years of experience has convinced us there can be no peace with a people who have no government and who don't even have a conception of reprehensibility of theft and banditry, end quote. Likewise, on October 4th, Yevdokimov unambiguously argued for the deportation of all Circassians to Turkey. Quote, as long as military forces are here and the police keep various rumors from spreading, the native population will no doubt remain peaceful. But as soon as some pretext appears for foreign interference, naturally the intriguers in Constantinople will continue to keep large native population here under observation and will continue all their efforts toward inciting them in a more or less hostile manner towards us. With this in mind, we will have to keep extra forces in the region, take special precautions, and establish a special surveillance regimen in the Western Caucasus, and consequently spend excessive funds. Even the most insignificant circumstances that occur when we're not well prepared can suddenly increase governmental expenses in the Kuban Oblast. Yevdokimov's emphasis on the costs of keeping the regions secure was due to the emperor's ambivalence toward financing the deportation. Yevdokimov was trying to convince the emperor that the cost of allowing the Circassians to stay would exceed the cost of deporting them. By early 1863, the war was all but over, and all further Russian actions can only be described as ethnic cleansing of the civilian population. By May, the Russians completely occupied the heart of the Jeddah lands and were moving on the Abzaks. According to Dravzdov, those who did surrender were given a choice to be settled where the Russians ordered them or go to Turkey. Cartographer Venyukov provides a different picture. Quote, the war was conducted with implacable, merciless severity. We went forward step by step, irrevocably cleansing the mountaineers to the last man from any land their soldiers set foot on. The mountaineers' owls were burned by the hundreds just as soon as the snow melted, but before the leaves returned to the trees. We trampled and destroyed their crops with our horses. If we were able to capture villagers by surprise, we immediately sent them via convoy to the shore of the Black Sea and farther to Turkey. Sometimes, to the credit of our troops, rarely, there were atrocities bordering on barbarity, end quote. By August, the Abzaks were begging the Russians to remain at their homes until October so that they could harvest their grain, but Yevdokimov refused. In September, the Russians occupied the Uruk Valley in eastern Circassia and chased the Hamish, a perennially pro-Russian tribe, to the peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, where they were trapped. Most fled over the ridge, and by late summer, Yevdokimov's army crossed the mountains and started driving them toward the coast. In summer 1863, the operation became even more methodical and thorough. A unit would travel up a river valley in search of owls, and the Circassians would flee into the woods. The Russians would burn the owls and any food they found, round up all the livestock, and go back down the mountain. There they would wait for a week or two, and then travel even further up the river valley in search of any makeshift huts the Circassians had built and burnt them. This process would be repeated 2 or 3 times until Yevdokimov was satisfied that everyone was either dead or driven out. This brings up an interesting point. In his field reports in the archives, Yevdokimov regularly admits statistics on Circassians sighted or captured while meticulously recording all other details. This stands in stark contrast to his description of Circassian attacks on Cossack stanitsi, in which he lists the approximate number of Circassians, locations, expeditions to find the attackers and rescue captured Cossacks, and so on. Here's a typical description of an operation in an owl. Quote, on August 27th, the battalions, 3 dragoon squadrons, and 100 Astrakhan Cossacks armed with 6 cannons crossed the Shish early in the morning across from the Shirvanskaya Stanitsa, went into Shikot's River Canyon, and setting up camp 4 versts beyond the Stanitsa, started clearing the forest in all directions. This continued until the 29th. During this time, enemy owls in the region were burned. A large number of Abzaks gathered near the detachment but took no hostile actions. In the evening of the 29th, the detachment moved into a new position 3 versts farther along the Shikot's Canyon. End quote. The obvious question, what happened to the Abzaks who gathered, is never answered. Also, what does Yevdokimov mean by a large number? Were there women and children? How many owls were burned? Were they occupied at the time? Yevdokimov never answers these questions.